Okay, Mary, so first we're going to talk about the Sacramento.
Yes, that one was wrecked on the 26th of April, 1853, and it was what's called a barque, spelled B-A-R-Q-U-E, which meant that it had three masts, and it was square rigged. That means the sails were across the ship on the front two masts, and the sail went stem to stern, fore and aft on the third mast. So that I did look that up and found out about that. So the Sacramento.
The Sacramento was the ship that was bringing out the immigrants.
Yeah, that's right. And how many people were on that ship?
There were 300 on the Sacramento.
300 on the Sacramento. Do we have the dimensions?
It was actually classified by Lloyd's as an A1 ship,
yes,
and the captain said that a finer barque had never travelled the seas.
Yeah. Yes, and it was, I'm sorry to...
It doesn't have...
Oh, that's right, it arrived before daylight, and obviously it was very difficult for them to get in through Port Phillip Heads, which of course is one of the most dangerous entrances to a port anywhere in the world, before daylight. So they waited outside, but then the tide and the weather drove her onto the outer reef at Point Lonsdale. Some people were landed on the beach from the ship's boats. The alarm was raised. Now that's an interesting question, because back then, of course, there was no lighthouse at Point Lonsdale, and so that it would have taken much longer back then for people to learn about what was happening. But the fact that in 1853 there would have been a large number of vessels coming to Melbourne, because it was during the gold rush in Victoria, where hundreds of ships arrived. So that's the way the message would presumably have got to the pilot, or the pilot saw it. And it says here in our information that the pilot boat went out, but could not come alongside because the ship was on the rocks and the surf was very strong. Now that means that passengers had to be disembarked from the ship, not onto a boat, which makes it ever so much more dangerous for them. It says with difficulty, all the passengers and crew were eventually landed. So that is a somewhat happier story about a shipwreck, because nobody, in fact, was drowned. So that the pilot boat, it says here, was able to transfer some of the cargo, but also that the ship rapidly broke up. Well, that's what happened to ships at that time.
And I suppose it was very distressing for the people on board, because a lot of them were immigrants coming from England.
Yes.
So they lost all of their possessions.
That's right. And in the case of the next shipwreck we'll talk about, we actually have a diary of from one of the survivors describing the feelings, because, of course, as he said, they arrived outside Port Phillip Heads. They thought they were nearly here, and that after a long voyage lasting months in difficult conditions on a ship, the feeling of expectation must have been huge. So that for that, their hopes to be dashed must have been incredibly difficult. And of course, it wasn't as if they were arriving in a town, because of course back in 1853 there was virtually nobody living at Queenscliff. The pilots were down there, camped on the beach down towards the pilot jetty, and there was virtually nobody else here, because in those days Queenscliff was farmland, but it wasn't farmland with open paddocks. It was virtually bush. And I gather from early memoirs of Queenscliff that it was quite possible to lose yourself when you were coming from the farm, where the homestead was up behind the Anglican church. It was possible to get lost in the bush on your way down to the beach, down where the pilots are now. And in those days also the indigenous people, the Wathaurong, were still encamped in the area. They used to camp apparently down near the Queenscliff railway station, and so they were often to be encountered in the bush. So that.
And I suppose too, it says that Pilot Mansfield, he actually was in charge of the salvage because there was a lot of gold on the ship that was coming to Melbourne.
Oh, yes.
And he was a pilot of only six weeks standing.
Yes,
so
they had to have so many pilots at the time because there were so many ships coming, and so they were taken on, and suddenly they were in. Was he the one who
put it in his bank?
Who put it in his bank and then was given money for the salvage?
Which was a £5,000.
£5,000.
Which in those days
was an absolute fortune. And then one of the other men, he received about £1,500. And he went on to establish a lighterage, that means a towing company in Melbourne, which later became the Melbourne Steamship Company. And they used to provide tug services for ships coming into Port Phillip. I know because my parents used to have to ring them before World War II, when ships were coming in through the heads. The lighthouse would notify Mum and Dad, who would ring Melbourne and organise tug facilities for incoming shipping, until the coming of World War II made shipping information classified as part of the war situation. So that it all went on. But the fact that he got the money out of the safe and took it and put it in his bank account was
amazing.
Quite an extraordinary story.
And the other part of the story too is that the news was brought to the Geelong Advertiser yesterday by the Reverend Mr. Lord.
Yes, he was.
So was he local?
I know nothing about that. We'll have to ask.
Oh no, he was chaplain to the Sacramento.
Yes.
So he travelled then to Geelong to tell them.
Yeah.
So they had no news of what had happened.
No news. And so that the whole landscape was different. No lighthouses and no lifeboats either until much later.
And it would have been quite a hard journey for them too. Their doctor had died on the boat.
Oh, that's right. Yes, he died not long out from England, didn't he? And refresh my memory.
An affection of the throat.
How many days?
10 days after leaving.
Yes, I know, but what was the duration of their journey?
It left England on the 22nd of December, so 4 months.
4 months, which is probably in those days relatively...
5 months.
5 months. Yeah.
Which is a long time.
Relatively. I think some took longer, did they? I can't remember. When the Columbine was wrecked on the 1st of April 1854, there were several people who were drowned, but one of the survivors kept a diary, and you can now listen to what I have written down as he wrote it. And it says here, in February 1854, we got into the southeast trade winds and crossed the line at 3 p.m. The line means, of course, the equator. On the 12th of February, a very